Well, welcome to today's webinar. Today is called Coming Together Virtually 101. Today's topic, you will learn how to introduce participants and effective methods of hosting or participating in Zoom meetings while presenting themselves in a professional manner. This webinar will also discuss what equipment is needed for participants to present themselves in a professional environment, differences between facilitation skill sets in remote sessions, the use of proper audio and video equipment to ensure full audience engagement. I want to mention a few things. Today's session is recorded. The presentation itself will take 45 minutes with a 15-minute Q&A period at the end of the session. However, you are more than welcome to put your questions in the chat bar and we'll be sure to get to them. At the end of the session, there will be a follow-up email with a copy of the presentation as well as a link to complete a survey. Once you complete the survey, you will then be entered to win a chance to win one of two $400 Visa gift cards. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Mark Seltzer and Justin Chorines. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Today, just as Elizabeth said, we're going to be going through a bit of a presentation, so I'll start that now, so long as we don't hear any complaints that go too loudly. So, we are going to be covering a few topics here today. Remote conferencing in general, not just Zoom, not just good habits, not just what equipment is needed, kind of everything and anything that is involved in those categories. So we'll start today by introducing ourselves to make sure you know who you're hearing from.
Welcome. We gratefully acknowledge and understand that we live and play here on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and we're coming to you from the Tsleil-Waututh Nations lands in the Burrard, just a little inland and up the fjord from Vancouver, and we're having a wonderful weather day today. And I really appreciate the introductions. Haishka OCM Nishkwelaka. I'm Mark. I'm born and raised Victoria, and we're hoping to when you finish this slide and at the end of the slideshow and you get your copy sent to you. There are some fabulous links that Justin's put together in the last slide for you to use for reference. So I'm glad you'll get them directly after the show.
My name is Justin Chorines. I've been working with Cardin Consulting for around 2 years now, just shy of 2 years, and I do a whole host of different jobs, but today I'm going to be utilizing about a decade of IT and technical support experience, as well as a couple years working with Indigenous governments and organizations to help improve their facilities and capacities. So without further ado, we'll get into what we're here for today. Covering it topic by topic, we are going into what is remote conferencing software, why it's important, why anyone should care, how to make their camera look pretty, what equipment is necessary and what isn't, things to do before a meeting, some good tips to keep in mind while you're either the host or a participant in any video conference, after a meeting or conference has concluded, as well as technical aspects and any questions. So going straight into today, we have first, why? Why does all this matter? Why is video conferencing a skill rather than just something you download and use day one, the exact same as the professionals do? It's very different from the Indigenous way of talking face-to-face, allowing for long conversations, pauses for information to flow. But that's not to say it's a bad thing. The benefit it has to Indigenous communities, such as ours that we've been working with, or those of even my family, are that it allows better representation of the people who might not otherwise get the same support, whether that be people who live remotely, may not have access to electricity or internet in the same capacity as some of us, may live in a way that is not as suitable to be able to participate in those kinds of things, especially during a historic pandemic as we're currently in the midst of. it has great potential to make sure that even aside from health concerns, that everyone is represented in their own community, and that the outreach of organizations, whether that be government, nation governments or not, is as high as it possibly can be.
And the one real advantage we think going forward is remote conferencing software in whatever form it takes, and we're all gravitating to Zoom right now. This remote conferencing software, I think, will benefit communities going forward. And I can give you a small example. The fact that we can bring an elders luncheon together over 4 households, each with his own iPad, to which are gathered 2 couples in their own pandemic bubble. And there are now 8 to 12 people having a lunch and then listening to the nation's membership rules discussion. So they're discussing their membership qualifications in their community. And we're having this over lunch with the elders. We're supporting that contact by then following up with a phone call and hard copies of the presentation. So this is the ability for leadership to reach out to all of its members wherever they are in a place that they choose that's convenient to them. And this is the kind of software that's going to allow that. And so going forward, that empowerment will go beyond the pandemic, as it were, because as you know, in remote parts of our province, you can be stuck there for a few weeks, and getting out and about in the middle of winter can be a bit of a chore. So connecting with your community, connecting with those elders, and bringing them together in their homes, with you being there to support and advise, is the future for everybody. That really we think we can work very well. So we'll continue on as to how you get there.
So today specifically, we're using Zoom to relay all this information to you. And it's a fantastic tool, even if it's not one we're all super familiar in terms of software goes. It's no Microsoft Word, for instance. It came to popularity about a year and a bit ago when the pandemic started on a global scale and people started needing video conferencing and video communication software, though that's not to say there haven't been a couple others bouncing around. Everything from Skype to Microsoft Teams to TeamSpeak to Cisco WebTalk, every single one of them has their own solution to this, but they all roughly cover the same feature set. So for the purposes of today, we're going to treat all of these presentation softwares and video conferencing softwares as one, a simple generic overview of how to outreach to others using video conferencing solutions. So we're going to reference Zoom specifically, but that's not to say the other platforms don't have their benefits, their drawbacks, and a very similar feature set. So getting started with that is, what do all the ridiculous settings mean? Because that's a big part of making sure that you're doing things right. It's very hard to have a video conference software when your mic and webcam aren't working, for instance. So a lot of settings and feature sets can be broken down into a few categories. The first of which being general settings, next audio and video, moderation settings, functionality settings, and profile settings. So going first, general settings cover things like, does the application open when your computer turns on? Where is it located within your computer? The very basic and generic things that don't particularly have relevance to everyday interactions. Audio-video settings are a huge portion of what makes a good presentation. Being able to accurately and clearly hear those people hosting or chairing a meeting, as well as being able to hear participants clearly, is a big benefit for obvious reasons. As well as video, being able to see and interact and make up a little bit of that gap that comes from remote conferencing. It is not person-to-person interaction, so without video you lose out on a little bit of that body language, the little nuances that come with human and even English communication. There's moderation settings, things like being able to moderate messages in a chat room, or be able to mute and unmute as participants please. There's also functionality settings, which is a broader term for things such as screen sharing, a green screen like we have here today, or file sharing, all of those things which might not necessarily be needed in every single meeting, but might make thematic sense depending on your subject matter. And finally, we have profile settings, one that Zoom specifically handles quite differently because For instance, a free profile or account on Zoom allows for a 1-hour time limit. Some of us may have bumped into that in the past where suddenly a meeting goes dead. And that's something that needs to be considered. So all of these you should have a look at ahead of time and poke around, see what you can't find. If you don't understand something, Google is your best friend, or you can just ask us. I've been using these programs for years and years and years now, so if there's a weird setting, I've probably seen it and messed around with it at some point. But going forward a little bit, we have what is important to remember for good video and audio interaction. So you can see a bit of a demonstration there between a beautiful picture of Mark and a royalty-free image of a woman that we found somewhere. And the difference is plain to see. One is well lit, one is clear, one is sharp. One has a very clear and distinct subject with a background that does not distract from the subject matter. The way that is done has a whole bunch of different moving parts, the first of which is lighting. So here, for instance, if you can see our camera, and I'm hoping you can, we have many lights set up throughout this little studio of ours. Not to say that that is a typical use case, but lighting being in front of and bright the subject very much helps. Most rooms come equipped with an overhead light of some kind, whether that be an LED panel, usually in an office space, or a ceiling fan with a lamp in it. All of them will be fine for navigating the room, but for video conferencing, that casts shadows on the subject's face. So eyebrows, forehead, nose, lips, chin will all become obscured when light is cast purely from down. Think of when you're looking...
The washroom you were saying.
Yeah. When you're looking in a mirror in the washroom where the lights are more or less face on versus a mirror in your bedroom where the light is usually up above you. The difference is pretty startlingly clear, and that's because of the direction of the light. Having a static background, just as that demonstration shows, is quite important. Because as much as we all have fun with some of the functionality of Zoom, I wouldn't usually recommend doing things in a frivolous manner. So backgrounds can cover everything from the typical messy bedroom to the child's toys to an unkempt whatever. And that's distracting. And it generally shows a lack of consideration for the experience of the people you're going to be facilitating with or participating in a community meeting with. As well, as much as we all might like this tropical background that Zoom has as a stock footage clip or the little nebula thing, it can be distracting and it can take away from certain subject matter or the ability for a person to simply look at a subject without getting distracted, for lack of a better term. Now, all of that is completely secondary to audio. The reason being, think about how the experience of remote conferencing affects you. For instance, if our webcam suddenly cuts out, like so, you can still hear and understand and gain a very full understanding of what we are communicating to you, even if you lack some small parts. However, if we mute ourselves, which I'm not going to do, but you can very easily imagine, the experience suffers tremendously, if not completely unsuccessful, because I don't know sign language, and I'm sure that there's a large population that doesn't as well. So audio is a very big piece of making this whole puzzle work. For the same reason we've had radio for long before we've had Star Trek face cam technology, because one is necessary, one is not.
And when you think of it, we use the word video conferencing, but we actually know that audio quality is the big driver in a video conference. So you can just imagine, without the voice to wrap around the images you're seeing to support what you're learning on a screen or interacting with somebody and you're not distracted by their background, the voice is what's going to carry you. So we've taken some time to enhance the audio experience for you by putting together a little different microphone system. So we actually have USB plug-in microphones. We've taken the time to make sure that the room we're in is acquainted to reduced sound. We've got curtains on one wall and a carpet on the floor and a carpet and a curtain on behind us. So we have a really quiet studio space. which makes it even easier for you to listen to, which is really important. And we've done everything we can to take care of any background noise. So we fortunately don't have anyone playing piano right now and practicing as they were a few hours ago. So that's fine. But if you've got someone in the next room who might be wanting to be vacuuming or doing the laundry or something, and you're working from home, be mindful those sounds can carry. And the better your microphone is and the closer you carry it to your body, the better the sound's going to be for your listeners, people you're participating with. And then ultimately, as we're learning, as we do a lot of this work in remote communities, stable internet connections are a real challenge. So in way to make yourself more available to a meeting, often we'll suggest respectfully that by disengaging your video function allows for a little better connectivity when you're speaking, because that's what usually gets affected. The voice gets disturbed or distorted. And more importantly, in a room where you are facilitating, ensuring that everyone has access close by to a microphone really does make the experience of those listening so much better. We work with some communities where there's a board table with only one microphone at the front of the room. So it does require for some of the speakers to come up and sit next to the microphone so that it's more audible and easier for us to listen to and understand. And more importantly, anybody else logging into that meeting also then benefits from having that better audio connection. So really, it's all about the sound.
Yeah. To expand on that a little further, Mark hinted at our setup here, having dedicated separate microphones as are in front of both of us. That is an option for everyone. Amazon sells them from the $10 range to the $10,000 range. It really comes down to what you're comfortable with. But the visual representation there, fuzzy versus clear, can be summarized by if we switch away from these dedicated audio sources to the ones built into our machine that we're broadcasting from, you can hear a huge difference in audio quality. We become tinny, echoey, hard to hear, far away, not pleasant to listen to. Whereas if we switch back to dedicated microphones, it's more of a radio style lack of disturbance sound that is easy to hear. And that's us trying to be considerate of the people participating, making sure you can hear, you can understand.
So you can vote for your to acknowledge that you could hear the difference. Just put a thumbs up or something, just to let us know that you actually it was really obvious to you that the sound was different. So we appreciate any comments or indications of that. So we know that it's really a paramount importance to make sure that you sound and your participants can hear you well.
So touching on that a little further, I said that Amazon sells them, but you can get this kind of equipment from anywhere from Best Buy to B&H Audio in the States to Future Shop isn't a thing anymore, but Amazon, basically any electronics retailer will have USB plug-in microphones. Very generally speaking, though not always entirely accurate, the more you spend on the microphone, the better they are going to be. I would always encourage reading ahead for your use case. For instance, a $300 microphone versus a $10 microphone will make absolutely no difference if they're on the other side of the room. Microphones work best when in proximity. Cameras as well will be something you want to look into. Even though they are secondary, having that personal eye contact, body language connection with someone, especially in Indigenous communities where those kinds of things are very highly valued, cannot be understated. So everything from, the cheap Chinese-made webcam is a significant improvement over nothing. So I would highly recommend it. But again, you can go as high as you'd like, which is why Googling what is the best microphone or what is the best camera will simply having you be in a little bit of disbelief that people can spend $100,000 on a microphone and genuinely be happy with it. So it's all about what you're comfortable getting. There are many different products. Try and read up on it. If you're considering getting equipment to expand what you are presenting, odds are someone has done the same and has a blog post somewhere to reference it. Lighting is something very important. Little USB plug-in ring lights. We use those here for when we have personal meetings, not facilitated by a group, and they work perfectly. Though the studio lights, as you see in the bottom picture, which we're using today, are much better for lighting a large area and are needed when you consider that cameras work the same way a human eye does. They absorb light to create a clearer image. The less light, the less clear the image. Moving on from that is what is a meeting made out of. specifically the components that you have to follow through with, aside from the technical side.
And not just kind of the technical side, because that's going to make the making of the meeting that much more successful. And so having a style and having a presentation that works inside a Zoom format is going to be important to carry your message forward. But having the good quality foundation of easy to be seen, a non-distracting background, doing your very best to make it a quiet space with a enhanced audio microphone is something we can highly recommend, because your participants are really going to become very aware of those changes. Meetings must be created ahead of time. It goes without saying, really. But the idea is you've got to plan it and know that inside of Zoom format, to be successful, you have to think about the preparation has to be aligned for the outcomes. You've got to make sure that what you're expecting is going to be properly designed for. So having an open discussion is important, but there are some technical components in a Zoom interface. You've got to have some ground rules. You got to have everyone understand what the process is for making a comment, raising a hand, waiting their turn, putting a speakers list together, as you would in a public session. So no different than that. One of the other really important parts is to make sure that all the conversation comes back to the host here at the front, and then it's commented back out. No, you want to discourage any kind of cross chatter through the Zoom interface, and even as it were, even in the chat room. That's a really important part of that as well. Justin will speak to that a bit later. The presentation, make it short and snappy, it be informative, and have the depth that you need to have to. And then you've got to leave room in this format to allow for feedback. So it means in your planning design, you've got to look at, bring some information forward, get a check-in, make sure people are understanding, make sure that what you've said and how you're being said and how you're being heard and understood is working. So it's a way of checking back in, and we'll be doing that very shortly. The other thing, of course, is when you're doing a presentation is really vital to have someone help to co-host. And that's really critical because it helps to do several things. Someone can monitor the chat, and we've learned with Justin's help that's really critical. And then that message or any of those concerns we brought back to the facilitator. Then your decision around how the meeting is going to be conducted, really give it some thought about who should be there, making sure that all those who are destined to be there have a chance to get there. So if you're reaching out to elders, you're reaching out to youth, make sure they have the facilities they can come to. And if they don't have their own equipment, find ways to bring them together in a socially responsible way so they can share a facility at perhaps an office. But an important part of setting up your room, of course, is using the waiting room. We like that because in a community setting, when we're having a public meeting in a community, we're not part of that community. We have as a co-host someone from the community who acts as someone who monitors the waiting room. They'll make sure that the people in the room are supposed to be in the meeting. It's really important that if it's a members-only meeting, that they qualify who the people in the meeting are. It's not my position to do that. I'm not from the community. So these are all things you have to think about just in advance. I mean, you're just like you're having a meeting in a room somewhere. This is a meeting room virtually.
And all of those kinds of things that Mark was speaking to just now can be found when you're actually creating it. A little menu pops up within Zoom or similar programs where you can set, does everyone just join? Do they join a waiting room? Can they unmute themselves? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things can be thought of ahead of time, which should definitely be done. Creating a link and sending that out ahead of time is a very important step to all that. But in addition, it has to be done right with times, both beginning and end being very clear, et cetera, et cetera. And also covered is a whole host of other settings, and I very much encourage you to poke around, see what you can't find, make sure everything looks good to you, and if you don't understand what something means, then feel free to Google it. There's a whole host of different support websites, programs, reviews, blogs, articles, news sites that all cover very similar topics of how to use Zoom, though sometimes without the experience to do so. Next up, we have meeting invitations, which sounds like a pretty obvious, well, yeah, you send out the link. What else is there to do? But there's some things to consider. How is it being sent out? Social media platforms such as Facebook, which tend to be very popular amongst Indigenous communities throughout Canada, as well as Twitter, a nation's own website or an organization's own website, group emails to known participants. Having those ready ahead of time can be huge, because having that prepared instead of fumbling at the last minute makes everything run better, reduces the stress on whoever is organizing it, as well as allows your participants plenty of heads up. In addition, maybe sending it just before so that the link doesn't get lost and they have it right at the top of an inbox or a feed without having to go and dig for it right before you go live.
So timing is important. Make sure the invitation is simple and has the information you want and not too much else. As Justin just alluded to, you have to think about some of your participants. How are they receiving this data? It could be on a mobile device, which is not very large. So if they're looking at their Facebook account and they're looking for a link about an event for a Zoom meeting, you've got to keep it really concise, the who, what, where's, and when's, and that way people can find it more easily. That's really critical because, as Justin says, people can get lost in your feed of materials. And if you have a rotation where you send the notice out a week before the event and then the 24 hours before the event, just as a reminder, that's the way to keep people's top of mind, and also makes the link very accessible.
So some things to consider on what you're sending ahead of time in that little box on the right-hand side. Time, start and end. End is just as important because people need to be able to schedule around this meeting. If you simply say, we start at 9 and we go till whenever, people might make obligations for later in the day to leave at 1 o'clock when in your mind you had an 8-hour meeting planned. And that can disrupt things quite a bit. Date or dates in some cases to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Summary of what topics are going to be covered and a plan for those topics, such as an agenda, very important. Having the link itself or other required invitation methods, such as a phone number to dial in the case of Zoom remote connections, and required materials in the case of something like education or facilitation, where you might want people to read certain materials ahead of time, prepare their own resources, etc. Those are all something you want to establish well in advance so that you don't face I didn't bring my pencil today. So you avoid some complication day of. Speaking to meeting agendas very quickly, those are very important for a few reasons. Prime amongst which is the ability to be flexible but still follow a plan. Specifically within Indigenous communities, an agenda should not be something that limits a meeting, rather something that enhances it. An agenda can have time at the beginning for introductions, taking time to remember that as Indigenous people, we tend to value our identity and our history quite a bit more than the Western style, I'm Justin Chorines, thanks for having me, and then move on. It typically tends to be, what would my Haida name be? What clan from the Haida Nation do I come from? What part of Haida Gwaii have I most seen? Where are my family from? How are they involved in this project? What company am I working with? All of those things are great points of pride for me, and I would like to share them. And having some moderator some ways say, oh, sorry, we're out of time, you had 30 seconds, can feel undervaluing to my perspective and my contributions. Not to say specifically me, but anyone in that position. So allowing time for both opening and closing is very important for the same reason.
So the idea then, if you expect 12 to 15 people to attend your meeting and you ultimately have a dozen people, you have to think about that the opening introductions in a good, well-rounded meeting format like we're suggesting will take 12 to 18 minutes. So that's something you have to think about as you put your presentation together. And as you do a wrap-up for your learnings at the end of the session, the same thing will happen again. So if your 1 hour presentation with time lot, you've now given up almost 35 to 40 minutes in intros and intros. So you're then left with less than half the amount of time available to do your work. So thinking about how it works, putting agendas together with that kind of respect will make your meetings very successful.
Along with those larger group dynamics can sometimes come some very passionate viewpoints. Many people, especially in Indigenous communities, have an involvement in either the government, the organization, topics being shared, and they have thoughts to get off their chest. Sometimes without considering other people's ability to speak and respecting that everyone has time commitments. So allowing for extra time to clearly outline a dispute resolution process, saying that we would love to hear everyone's opinion, though if it does go down a personal route, we encourage you to contact that person one-on-one so that we can respect the time of everyone here. Limiting and moderating that kind of discussion can really help everyone's feeling of security and make it a safe place for everyone to share their viewpoints without feeling like they may be interrupted or come into conflict with others. In addition to that, one of the good ways to make sure everyone is involved and engaged is to insert breaks throughout at regular intervals. I think a few slides down, we have a break scheduled, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We are going to encourage you to get up, walk around, get a coffee, maybe hug a dog or something, because we want you to feel engaged and not feel like you're sitting there in, the classroom that we've all been in for 8 hours while the professor lectures us or high school teacher lectures us. Is not fun. And we don't want to mimic that, especially in a platform that lends itself so easily to people simply disconnecting or turning off their video and going somewhere else and doing whatever without listening. And that's more or less normal. We shouldn't expect anything different because we all have very strenuous time commitments, but we want to make it as enticing as possible. And we want to... we also want to, as Mark was saying earlier, plan time for introductions and conclusions. Now, the next part of that is the materials used in all of this. In this case, it's a PowerPoint presentation, but this applies to videos, pictures, a script, facilitation notes, anything. Make sure that they are prepared ahead of time, well ahead of time. One, so they can be reviewed by either yourself, allowing for a bit of a time gap, or by a peer to make sure that some common spelling and typos and all of those kinds of things are avoided, as well as the more macro view of ensuring that everything is relevant within your presentation. Being familiar with your material ensures that you're not going to be stumbling and sitting there reading the entire slide before you can continue your presentation because you can't remember what you wrote, which is normal to some degree, but it falls into the next point of reading a PowerPoint is not a presentation. And saying it word for word is not a good facilitation route, nor is it a good way to chair a meeting, nor is it a good way to present an idea, even if you're only a participant. Most who are going to be joining this can read, and even for those who can't, simply monotone reading your presentation does not give the same emphasis and knowledge as expanding upon ideas and giving your own perspective. That's where good presentation comes from. In addition, the material that you're going to be presenting is going to have to cater to a lower denominator, and especially knowing your audience is going to be very important. Among Indigenous communities, a lot of our elders did not have the same advantages that I do, for instance. So reading beyond a certain level becomes very challenging, as well as being able to actually have computer software and computer systems that can display high definition is sometimes a huge issue with connectivity of internet and energy. So large text, simple visuals, easy to understand, and ensure that even if all of your presentation materials fail right then and there, you still know how to continue. And we go into that a little bit later, but essentially the show must go on. So we've reached about the halfway point, both in our presentation and pretty darn close in our timing. Wow, that's good. For a little health break. So go walk to the kitchen, grab a blankie or a puppy or something, and ensure that you have a little bit of time to, go relax a little bit. And we'll check in about 5 minutes and ensure everyone's ready to come back. It says 10 minutes there, but I'm making it 5 just by lawful decree. So 5 minutes just to respect everyone's time, ensure we finish at 3 for us. So thank you very much, and we'll check in soon.
Some participants can be allowed to share if they're being called upon. And then, of course, using the on and off video function to stay engaged with your audience.
So expanding on the few of the points that Mark was just making, some of the things to keep in mind as you're either chairing a meeting, facilitating a session, presenting an idea, or even just participating in what's being shared. The people who are going to be organizing that event should and hopefully will connect early, either to answer advanced questions, introduce themselves, welcome individuals, make sure everyone feels valued as they participate, in addition to testing their own equipment, helping others to do the same, all very common courtesy things to do. It helps create a better atmosphere. It helps the meeting start on a really good foot. And it helps you to introduce yourself because people have already begun to become familiar with who you are, how you speak, and how you present. So especially in an Indigenous community or organization, introducing yourself with humility and respect is a very, very big part of how that should be done, because we, especially here, are not perfect authorities. We may have missed something. We're here to learn just as much as anyone is. We're here drawing from a decade plus of experience using this kind of technology and working with it professionally, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things we haven't thought of. We're not here to dictate how you should do things. We are simply giving at best advice as we can. Establishing rules for the meeting right at the outset is the last point we have here, and it's a great point to have because Mark said it a little bit ago. Speaking, muting, and making sure video on or off as your preference dictates. Having that right at the beginning makes sure that you aren't going to have to pause, interrupt the flow of either a community feedback session or a meeting between staff just to address a tiny little technical issue that might be ruining the whole experience. So next up, we have how those moderation steps might be undertaken. Mark said it a little while ago that having a co-host or a separate person connecting to this meeting and helping to moderate these things can make this go much smoother. Because as I'm presenting to you, I can't read the chat at the same time. So Mark is taking care of that. While he's speaking, I'm doing the same. And even if we weren't in the same room, I would be doing that from my end in a very similar vein. So answering questions, helping people with technical problems, making sure that if someone walks away from their microphone and starts playing with their cat, that those noises don't start interrupting the general experience of the rest of the participants. Those kinds of things are invaluable, especially when there's a lot of work having gone into a presentation, making sure there's enough of the proper audience to appreciate it, etc. So those things are very much best not left till the last minute. You should establish who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, and what you'd like to see well in ahead of time. A lot of those settings can be found within Zoom, Skype, etc. So have a look at those. And if you have questions, again, Google is your best support, or me, because I happen to be here today and I faced most issues that people have faced before. So we also have a few tips on how the camera works as a part of video presentation and video conferencing. So video presentation is a very different skill set than in-person presentation, simply because it is not a series of habits that we are used to, especially in Indigenous communities where elders have been essentially practiced in public speaking for decades. So suddenly having a medium of a camera and a microphone, there's a very easy habit to use a lot of hand gestures and suddenly start, leaning off screen, and suddenly you can only see half of my face, and it's really not very convenient. So having those boundaries of the camera set in advance really, really helps. In addition, something that happens a lot when we're using laptops, for instance, they have webcams built in. And because they are above the screen or sometimes below the screen, we can tend to want to read text and get in just a little bit closer. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're reading and looking straight down. And so you can only see the top of my head, which is not a great view. I know, believe me. So you want to avoid things like that, speaking directly to the camera rather than to the material. Keeping the lighting for these cameras centered. So if they work just like eyes where they gather light, if you have a light behind you, they'll see the light perfectly, but because there's no light reflecting from your face, you'll be a blackened outline, just as we showed in the previous example a few slides ago. Commit to memory where you can move in and off camera. That includes your hands or fellow participants. That includes forward and back, not just up, down, left, and right, because if you go too far back, these cameras are not perfect, nor do they convey perfect video. Even if you have a 4K camera, it may only be being received on a VHS quality video stream. So being relatively close to the camera, very well front light coming at you, those are all things to remember for sure. And being aware of your background, as a point we covered before, is a big part of being considerate. Because if you have children or dogs running around in the background, even if they're not making noise, it's distracting and can take away from what might otherwise be a serious topic or a solemn moment or a shared experience that might be brought forward. The next part is audio. This is actually, Mark said it very, very nicely earlier, that it is the more significant half of this audio-visual experience. Because again, the audio is what conveys the ideas, not the visuals. So staying close to a microphone and speaking towards it, that is not just for separate dedicated microphones such as these, that can cover even a microphone in a laptop, for instance. I'll demonstrate it here with this one. As I continue speaking, if I lean away from the microphone, I suddenly become much harder to hear. As I roll my chair back, I become outright impossible to hear sometimes. And that is because microphones work very similarly to any audio device, like a human ear. The further away something is, the harder it is to hear. Avoid and monitor background noise, and that's for the same reason, but even more so, it's distracting. Though it can also even be impeding to a presentation or to a meeting in general. Say, for instance, as I continue talking here, if Mark is speaking at the exact same time, a digital signal can only process so information, so it may sometimes have to pick and choose what you hear. Not both, only the one. So I may be cut off entirely because my washing machine is going behind me, and that's something you want to be conscious of at most times, as well as understanding that muting yourself when you aren't speaking generally tends to be preferred, because breathing, typing, tapping the table, whatever it is, can be picked up and can be quite loud, especially on a platform like Zoom that may even take the camera away from the person speaking and highlight you when you didn't mean to and you're just sitting there staring off into space. So it can be disruptive, and you want to make sure that those things are kept in mind. Being gentle with a microphone, again, including ones built into laptops or computers of any kind, because if you think of a microphone built into a computer, it has a keyboard on it. That keyboard doesn't sound very loud when you're typing on it, but if a microphone works the same way as a human ear, it's essentially someone typing on your head. You'd like to avoid that. Speaking clearly and loudly, you want to make sure that people can hear you. That's something that people often overlook, is that if I have a microphone right in front of me, I might be able to talk like this really quite quiet and sound very monotone, when in fact, that doesn't work at all. It makes for a boring presentation, and it makes for a very hard to understand experience. So you have to present in the same way you would as if there were a crowd of people in front of you. I've already covered the mute while not speaking. Mark summed this up incredibly well earlier, so I don't think I'll spend too much time on this, but encourage people to give feedback. Leave spaces for people to share, especially in indigenous communities where we have symptoms from residential school experiences or intergenerational residential school upbringings. Those kinds of easily shareable experiences might not suddenly be so easy when there's a history of any participation in a conversation being frowned upon. So allowing for a very inviting space, allowing for very large pregnant pauses, as they're sometimes called, but ensure that you're being as considerate as possible for some things that may be of a sensitive nature. Being polite and be the bigger person. Sometimes you just meet people who want to argue. That happens a lot, especially over the internet. And you simply have to know, and I've struggled with this quite a lot, is knowing when to say, I appreciate your opinion and thank you for sharing. We'd like to move on, and you continue. Because sometimes, no matter how logical the argument, no matter how pleading the rebate, there's always going to be something that people want to latch onto to be angry about. So that's something that has to be considered when you're just going with it, whether it be your presentation fails, your webcam fails, your microphone fails. There's always going to be a backup solution, and you should always plan for those things. Be considerate of other people, but know that they'll be considerate of you. We've all been a part of these Zoom meetings now. We know that microphones fail. We know cameras fail. We know that no matter what you do, your kid might come screeching into the room. So apologize, continue as best you can.
And the show must go on. And then important is that when we finish your presentation, give the details about your upcoming meeting. Thank everyone for being there. Enjoy their time. Create meeting minutes and follow up with those. Send them off as quickly as thereafter possible. And ongoing relevant documents. And as what I've said earlier when we opened up, it's the practice now that Elizabeth will then send this PowerPoint to the participants. And the next slide, which we'll have, I believe, has our, yes, there they are. So this is where you would go if anyone has any questions. This slide is amazing. Follow these links, you'll get most of your questions answered. So
yeah, these are support resources from a couple universities as well as the Zoom support site. Generally speaking, computers are wonderful when they work and stress-inducing, to put it mildly, when they don't. So if something doesn't work, Google is your best friend. If sometimes that doesn't help, video solutions such as YouTube, Dailymotion, all those things, people have submitted their own fixes to things. Finding multiple resources is often the best, or an experienced person, be that your typical youth who has tons of experience with those kinds of things, or someone who just has done a lot of this and has had all these bugs happen to them and remembers how they fixed it. Those things are invaluable for a whole host of reasons, but especially that. We have reached now the point where we would invite some questions, but thank you very much to Elizabeth for allowing us to ramble on for quite a while here as we continue, and we're happy to help in any way we can.
That's awesome. Cindy, do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions. I think what I'm going to do is to Google some stuff that I have going on, as well as, just play around, because one of my questions is I have never recorded. I know I need to ask permission, but once I record a meeting, where do I go, or what happens? Like, how do I retrieve that recording afterwards?
That's a fantastic question. So if I may, I have a lot of experience with that in film and video production over the years. What happens when you press that little record button, you'll be given one of two options: record to this device or this computer, if that happens to be the case, or record to the cloud. Both have their ups and downs. Cloud recording means that it goes to these Zoom services and they'll send you a link to retrieve that video later. That means you don't have to take up space on your computer. That means your computer is not going to be slowed down by processing it. But on the flip side, the video quality is frankly quite bad and can suffer from very large video glitches, which are not ideal for a professional recording. So for instance, anything which you might want an organization or funders to see, you might record to a local computer to ensure the recording is as high quality as possible. But the downside to that is your computer will be significantly slowed while it processes that recording, because it's very, very, very much data that it's going to have to chew through, especially for a long meeting. Once it's finished processing that video, it's going to ask you, where should I save this? And you'll have options to save it in various folders, but typically somewhere easy to remember is best, and you can move it later. A desktop, downloads, those kinds of things are all ones I use to then move it to the end desired location. Once that is processed and you've saved it to the right location, it'll save a video file, an audio file, a text file. I can't remember what the fourth one is, but there's definitely four. Come back to me on that one. The video file is the video and audio all scrunched together all in one. The audio file is just as it sounds, the audio only. So you may want to use that if you're just listening in the car to catch up on a lecture or some lessons that you might want to review. And the text file is the chat as it passed, so that people like Mark and I could review individual questions and email participants back after the fact to finalize or answer those. Does that help at all, Cindy?
Yes, it helps. Helps a lot. Perfect.
Are you looking to be create your own presentations and organize meetings over Zoom, are you, Cindy?
I'm thinking I possibly might have to be doing that. Yes, so I would like to play around and be prepared.
Right. And this is to work with your community or a corporate or an organization?
But both.
Yeah.
Both.
So yeah, some of the experiences we've had have been very varied and many, but this is a great way to get your community connected. And if the weather goes bad on you up there, you can still make a meeting if Zoom becomes an option to get there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, who would have thought we would be living in a virtual world? I can say prior to COVID, I knew what Zoom was. I've heard of it, but I've never utilized it. And adjusting to Zoom was a struggle at first. And with COVID, it's been a year now, and utilizing Zoom, I can say still to this day, I need some help. So it was a great reminder watching this webinar. And I guess with that said, thank you, Mark and Justin, for presenting. Thank you, Cindy, for presenting in today's webinar as well. We do have the same webinar this Thursday, so if you know of anyone who would be interested, please feel free to share the topic with your networks. It is sunny, and I'm going to go enjoy the sun. So you guys all have a great rest of your day.
You too.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye now.
Perfect. Thank
Good
you.
afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.